The socioeconomic elements of race, even though you individually might not be racist. I think that's hard for people to talk about and put there, because they say, oh, I'm not racist. Well, you might not be, but that doesn't negate the historical elements of race in our country and the way it's affected wealth distribution, essentially.
On October 8th, Tanner Colby came to the Johnson County area to do a presentation on his new book, Some of My Best Friends Are Black. Here's a video on some of the topics that he discussed in his presentations and why they're important to society today.
So the book that I wrote is called Some of My Best Friends Are Black, The Strange Story of Integration in America. I pitched my editor on the idea of writing a book about racial integration from the middle-class white person's point of view. Why there were no black people in my high school, or in my workplace, or in my neighborhood, or at my church, and so on and so forth. I wrote this book because I was curious. And the reason I wound up in Kansas City, even though I don't live here, was a buddy of mine from college grew up in Overland Park, and he said, well, if you want to write about real estate segregation, go to Kansas City. And I learned about J.C. Nichols and the whole history of the Country Club District, and how he built the Country Club District west of Troost, and then after Brown v. Board, they drew the boundary at Troost to protect all those neighborhoods, and they said, let the east side go black. And then the blockbusters, who were the predatory real estate speculators who were flipping these neighborhoods and driving white people out of the city, basically laid waste to east of Troost, while the west side J.C. Nichols communities stayed mostly whole.
Troost got named after one of Kansas City's most prominent citizens, Benoist Troost. It became very much of a center of the very wealthiest citizens in Kansas City. And we went to white flight, and Troost becoming almost a ghost town and no one wanting to invest there.
Johnson County wouldn't have existed without white flight, or it would have been a very different animal. Troost just happens to be where the dividing line where people live. And the amazing thing is that it's stuck so deep in people's imaginations that it's become almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that east of Troost means this or west of Troost means that. The 4963 neighborhood in Kansas City, it actually straddles Troost, which is kind of a remarkable thing. On the east side, the black community used to be pinned in around 18th and Vine. And then after Brown v. Board in 1954, they started moving south, but they were always funneled south and east, so that they stayed east of Troost and the west Troost stayed white. And these blockbusters would go into neighborhoods and they would move a black family in on the block, and they'd wait a few days and they'd start calling all the old white ladies. It was this really pernicious cycle of feeding on people where they would exploit fear of black people to get white people to sell their homes and pay more for homes out here, and at the same time then turn around and sell that house east of Troost at an inflated value back to a black family, to where the black family would default on it after 6 months, and then they'd flip it and sell it to a few more black families over the course of a year.
I remember when this city had all these public things that were so wonderful, especially Swope Park and the swimming pool. And I remember that as a kid. And then when there was the white flight, we couldn't go to any of those places anymore.
It's created the environment we lived in, and it's created this sprawled, sort of autocentric metropolitan area. Kansas City didn't used to always be that way. We had the third largest streetcar system in the country. We had very walkable neighborhoods. We had a killer city,
Anything that was a public resource that would, by definition, need to be shared by the common good and therefore be given access to black Americans, we sort of abandoned it or destroyed it. Public transportation, public schools, basically anything with the adjective or modifier public in front of it, we moved away from.
I think we're trying to get back to that. I think we realize what we miss in terms of those public transportation elements and that walkability elements. Really what's happening is you have a shift of socioeconomic issues, and some of these neighborhoods are still in the urban core, but they're becoming predominantly middle-class white, right? And I don't think that's what we want as a city, because we're just recreating the issue.
Race and socioeconomic issues go hand in hand, generally speaking. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, they go hand in hand. And so what you're seeing is a shift with people who can afford those downtown condos we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. And most of the people that can afford those downtown condos are white because they have They have the wealth and the money to afford that. And then real estate taxes go up. The people who were there before can afford the real estate taxes. Therefore, they have to move out of the neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a shift. There's so many degrees of racist and prejudice,
Right.
so I use that term very loosely. But even if that exists, the distribution of wealth and the ability to pass wealth on to generations, and the fact that integrating neighborhoods will start the domino effect, and then you have education, et cetera, et cetera.
My current job as a children's author gives me an opportunity to speak at schools and libraries, and the majority of my books are around science. So I actually gave a talk at the Missouri Libraries Association about how race affects the books that children see. It's very integrated. Most of the heroes are not people of color. Most of the love stories are not about people of color. And so we are starting to see studies, even in England, that says kids are writing stories who are minorities about white kids. And when they're asked, why don't you write stories about yourself, the answer always comes back, but stories are about white people.
Moving forward, and especially for our children, if they don't have a certain level of racial competence to navigate this new world that's being created by these demographic changes, they're going to be screwed. And we're not going to have a very healthy country.
What happens if you're coming from a family that can't tell you, these are the things that you should ignore, this is the advice that's valid? And I'll interview kids from a Pembroke or a Barstow, and what I'll realize is they get a completely different subset of information. So they're told, here are all the stars, you should reach for them. Then I go into areas that are segregated, and the kids are told, reach low, think about community college.
If you want to understand yourself and how to navigate this country and what race means, and especially now that we're becoming a much more multicultural and diverse country, you have to know this stuff. And so it's important for people to engage with it, learn about it, and talk about it. It's very uncomfortable, and people are scared to talk about it because honestly they don't realize how easy it is. Once you get used to it, it's like anything else. It's like riding a bike. Once you get used to it, and once you have the knowledge and the confidence to seriously address the issue, it's actually fascinating to talk about. You can talk about it endlessly. But the first few times you do it are very difficult and very awkward and very charged. And so people rarely have the sort of courage to push through those initial difficult conversations to get to the real important ones on the other side.